Hi everyone, welcome to another video. James here with you on Friday morning. We're listening to Quincy Jones. This is a version of Bridge Over Troubled Water, and this LP is on the label Music for Pleasure, MFP, which is the theme of today's video. MFP, if you grew up in the UK back in the day, you'll know this label. I'm sure you'll know it anyway. MFP was a budget label which released a huge number of really high quality LPs through the 60s and the 70s, going into the 80s. It became one of the biggest, most successful budget labels of all time. It was actually a collaboration between EMI Records and the publisher Paul Hamlin, and the idea was to license lots of great music. They also used to do original stuff as well. They used to commission West End musical albums and so on. And there was another subsidiary label called Classics for Pleasure as well, which focused on classical music. But the idea was to license good music and press it onto highly affordable LPs, which then flooded into the nation's shops and allowed people such as myself, who might have missed certain LPs, first time round, to catch up on some great music. They didn't just release rubbish, but they focused their attention on classic music, classic rock and so on. The Beatles and Pet Sounds was released on MFP. A lot of solo Beatles stuff, Pink Floyd's Relics came out on MFP. So it was a really big label for a long time, and it had a very distinctive logo, which we'll look at in a minute. My first experience of MFP was actually children's records. When I was very young, I had various children's records on the label, and that was actually a yellow label. And a bit later on, I started to get my first LPs. I've not managed to dig them out, but I had a Pinky and Perky LP. Pinky and Perky were a pair of singing, talking pigs in the UK, and they brought out some albums on MFP, and they were on the red label. But the first kind of major rock album that I recall getting, and this comes with a kind of sad story, but when John Lennon was taken from us in 1980, I'd only just got into the Beatles, and I'd only really heard Revolver. I didn't know any of their early stuff. So shortly after John's death, my parents bought me this record. This is Rock and Roll Music Volume 1, which had originally come out, I think, in 1976 in the States. It came out as I think it was a twofer, Rock and Roll Music Volume 1 and Volume 2. And then MFP brought out two separate editions for the UK. This one, the first volume in blue, and the second volume in red. And this was the first time that I'd ever heard some of the pivotal songs, in the Beatles canon. Twist and Shout, I Saw Her Standing There, You Can't Do That, I Want to Be Your Man, I Call Your Name, Boys, Long Tall Sally, Rock and Roll Music, Kansas City, Money, Roll Over Beethoven. I mean, I was 9 years old at the time, and not only had I not heard the Beatles versions of those songs, but I'd never heard the originals either. I'd never heard the Chuck Berry versions. I'd never heard this, that, and the other. So this was a hugely important album for me, and I used to sit in my bedroom listening to it just constantly, and looking at the picture of John, and just asking myself why. So let me show you the label. I'm sure you've seen it before, but it's a very distinctive label, black on red. And this record is still in really great shape, given that I've had it for over 30 years. There we go. MFP. So that's the first big kind of rock album that I recall having on the label, and that gives you some indication, I suppose, of the calibre of music which they released. You know, they were not just one of these crappy labels that brought out rubbish. They were really dedicated to the cause, I suppose, and the stuff they brought out was always sort of good quality. It was cheap and cheerful. There was nothing particularly fancy about it, but they were just nicely packaged LPs which always sounded good, and they chose really good material to release. And often it was my first encounter with, you know, whichever music it was. If we kind of fast forward a few years now, this was bought, I remember, I can date this exactly, the summer of 1992. I just moved to Leeds, and there was an open street market there, and there was a guy who had a record stall, and I bought this album for the princely sum of £2.50. Ike and Tina Turner, River Deep, Mountain High, just a compilation. But at that point, I'd never heard any of Tina and Ike's classic sides. You know, I knew Simply the Best, but I hadn't really heard classic Tina. So as far as I know, this Inner was exclusive to MFP. I think so anyway. I stand to be corrected, but you always had a thing, care of your record, steps 1 to 5. And then you had this important notice here about music piracy. And then you normally had an address, EMI Records, 20 Manchester Square, London. You know, you had a kind of address on there. Often the address, I think they were based in Middlesex. MFP were actually based in Middlesex, and that address often used to pop up. Now I'm not going to show you every record. There are some variations of labels. This one is the same as the previous one, the Beatles one. But this record, much like the Beatles one, this kind of knocked my socks off, because it was my first encounter with classic, hard-driving 60s soul R&B. River Deep, Mountain High, A Love Like Yours, Don't Come Knocking Every Day, Such a Fool for You. It's quite a hard driving comp with great artwork. So that was a really notable one for me, Ike and Tina. And then another record that blew my mind several years later, and the cover's a bit dodgy on this one. Bobbie Gentry. This is Way Down South, and I bought this purely on the strength of the cover and because it was dirt cheap. I got it from Oxfam, £2.49, and I thought it was going to be a bit middle of the road. It's actually one of my favourite records of all time. You know, it's kind of smoky southern pop rock. You know, she has a very alluring voice.
My man's over there on Parchment Farm, sitting there on Parchment Farm. My man's sitting there on Parchment Farm. He ain't never done nobody no harm.
Great material, Oklahoma River Bottom Band, Big Boss Man, Parchment Farm, and so on. Fantastic record. I've sent this as VCLT a couple of times to different people. So yeah, Bobbie. What became of Bobbie? Okay, this one, bought in Amsterdam, I don't recall when, many years ago. This is George Harrison, Dark Horse, this is an 80s repress of a 1974 album, and what they did was they used the back cover of the original album as the front cover of this. The original front cover of Dark Horse had a nice shot of one of George's old school photographs, and this was the back cover with George on a park bench with his big silly shoes on. So, and this is my only copy of this album, so it's thanks to MFP that I have this record. And this one actually, this is on the Black Parlophone label. So even though MFP brought it out, it's actually on parlophone, which is interesting, but you can see the MFP there for all to see. So there's George. And by a similar token, this is my only copy of Mind Games by John Lennon. And this is the MFP edition, which has a different colour lettering, I think, to the original. The cover is slightly different. So just check to see whether there's anything interesting going on with the label. No, it's just the standard MFP again. So yeah, Mind Games. A band I got really into in my late teens, and this is one of the main comps that I had, which introduced me to their lesser known stuff, was The Move. 1960s kind of pop, mod, occasional psych band from Birmingham. And this album collects together some kind of interesting offbeat stuff, so you don't get things like Fire Brigade and Blackberry Way, but you do get stuff like Kilroy Was Here, which is an album track from their first album. You get Useless Information, which was a great B-side. You get Hello Susie from the Shazam. Tell me the news about yourself. I love Susie, I love Susie. Tell me that you enjoyed yourself. Very attractive record, isn't it? The Move. We have The Temptations, Get Ready, which is, this is more of a pop compilation. I don't think it's got any of the kind of classic Norman Whitfield stuff on it, but it was a fun comp to pick up. I didn't have any of their music in my collection at the time. This one has got a slight variation of label, I think. This is on the yellow Sounds Superb Music for Pleasure label. And then the final few I have are actually quite recent purchases, because I still do find these albums in the wild fairly regularly, and I always pick them up when I do. So we have T-Rex, Ride a White Swan, which is a good one. Deborah, Ride a White Swan, Elemental Child, a bit of classic Bolan, and then we have one for Lise here, The Animals, House of the Rising Sun, We've Got to Get Out of This Place, it's a good one. And the last one I have for you is The Hollies, not a band that I ever particularly checked out back in the day, but whose music I do enjoy now, thanks to MFP. And this has a slight variation of label. Their version of Poison Ivy, He Ain't Heavy Is My Brother, Bus Stop by Graham Gouldman. Really, it was the same story as before. You know, music that I didn't know, and then it was MFP which introduced me to it. So as a label, it's been really important all the way through my life. It's kind of been there for me, you know, and. Certainly with this record, this goes right back to the very start of my musical passions, and from here I branched out into all sorts of stuff. So thank you MFP, EMI and Paul Hamlin for a wonderful venture. So do you have any MFP albums? If so, I'd love to see them. Alright folks, that's your lot for today. I will see you soon. Have a great week. Bye-bye.